This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising on working solely in technology and cybersecurity law sector. In each episode, we look at recent stories in the news relating to digital technology around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. For more information on the stories that we're covering this week, check the links in our show notes. By way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and I'll let Peter introduce himself and then we'll dive into the stories for today.
Hi everyone, my name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law. I've just got a couple of stories to update you on today, which is particularly interesting from a sort of regulatory perspective. So I'll pass back to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So the stories that we're going to be covering today are the firm hacked after accidentally hiring the North Korean cybercriminal, the new data bill, and Meta's launch of AI celebrity scam crackdown. But before we dive into today's stories, here is some background information on our podcast producer, Anson Evaluate. Anson Evaluate are a consultancy company offering a variety of services including data protection training, outsourced data protection officer services, and specialising in advising clients over multiple jurisdictions. So, talking about another jurisdiction, that leads us very nicely into our first story of the day. So, a firm hacked after accidentally hiring a North Korean cybercriminal. I mean, this just screams newsworthy, doesn't it? I mean, surely you're aware enough when you're working for any sort of company that candidates are screened before you're then employing them. I mean, it's fairly common in the UK for is it CRB checks or DRB checks?
DBS.
There we go. DBS checks.
Disclosure and barring service. Yes.
Fairly routine for those to be carried out for these types of roles. And yet, companies have been hacked after accidentally hiring a North Korean cybercriminal as a remote IT worker. So the unidentified firm hired the technician after he faked his employment history and personal details. And once given access to the company's computer network, the hacker downloaded sensitive company data and sent a ransom demand. The firm is based in the UK, US, or Australia, so fairly broad there, but did not want to be named. I wonder why. It has also allowed cyber responders from SecureWorks to report the hack to spread awareness and warn others. Well, I feel like kind of stating the obvious there is a fairly big warning. You do your checks and you do your due diligence and you look deeper than surface level, surely.
Yes. So the interesting thing here is it reflects what have become sort of post-pandemic hiring practices. Very often you'd have, in particular, if you're going to have workers working remotely, IT was more likely to be the sort of subject where that would be the norm before the pandemic. But certainly since then, I know a lot of people in IT who now start working on fairly big contracts where it's all done entirely remotely. The interview process, the recruitment process, everything is handled remotely. So you never actually necessarily see someone face to face in a room. And indeed, then the entirety of the role is then delivered remotely as well. Sometimes on some very large and complex transactions, you'll have whole teams where no one's ever in a physical room. It is all handled remotely. So the example here is very much reflecting what is now normal established practice for a lot of roles, particularly in IT. And in this instance, because of the nature of the role, and Amelia mentioned there about the idea of criminal records checks, the disclosure and barring service, that tends to be the sort of thing that people will do if they are being recruited into a highly regulated area. So for us, for example, as a law firm, we might undertake those sorts of checks for anyone working with us. The disclosure and barring service was introduced in the UK after it was found that a school caretaker that had been hired had had a previous conviction for child-related crimes in another local authority area. But the local authority he moved to didn't know about this, hired him, and then unfortunately that individual was Ian Huntley, who became the sole murderer. So that's where DBS came from 20 years ago. So that, of course, is where you're working with children. So you can imagine those are the sorts of roles where very often people will think, well, we'll therefore get a DBS check. Whereas if you're working remotely, you won't be thinking, well, there's a risk to vulnerable people that someone might be working with. But in this instance, I think you do need to think quite carefully when it comes to IT, because, of course, what will an IT worker potentially have access to? And in this instance, it turns out the individual was not who they thought they were. Basically, a profile was supplied. It turned out that the image used had been amended using AI. So it was a sort of stock image you find online. It was then tailored through AI. This individual was actually based in North Korea. It doesn't say if they were state-sponsored, a state-sponsored actor or not, but it wouldn't be surprising because they ended up abstracting a load of corporate data and then ransoming the company to get its data back. And certainly using ransomware and ransoms is a known method of the North Korean state to raise foreign currency. So we don't know if it was or wasn't. The BBC don't really want to say that in their article. But the point is that it wouldn't surprise us if it was. But I think the reason we want to talk about this today is it just highlights the fact of making sure you know exactly who it is you are recruiting. Particularly if you are in a highly regulated sector. So if you are in something like medicine, law, accounting, pharmaceuticals, financial services, banking, insurance, you might want to think about the due diligence that you're having in place to make sure that the person that you're recruiting is the person that you think they are. So that might mean sort of really checking, is it possible that they are where they say they are located? Could they be using a VPN or other software to try and impersonate the location of where they say they are? Are they able to answer, to jump on calls at short notice? Can you then perhaps call them without notice and see if they are available and working during the working hours that they say they are? And then probably once they're working, in this instance, this individual was then able to go to probably parts of the system and start downloading large volumes of data, and no one picked up on it. So actually being able to look at sort of access logs and see where individuals are accessing data and potentially downloading large quantities of it, does that trigger an alarm somewhere? You know, do you have compliance staff who are tipped off if there are online habits of any individual with access to the network where they may be acting in a manner that is not what will be considered normal in respect to their activity? So that there are all sort of things that you can think about in terms of checks that might be a good idea in this instance to then protect yourself from what happened here, which is all that data being downloaded and then facing a ransom to try and get it back.
And that's just it, actually. He used the firm's remote working tools to log into the corporate network. So then it's looking at double checking the security behind that corporate network. Has it got the necessary security measures in place? That, again, is kind of diving deeper, kind of away from the fact that this guy had stolen essentially someone else's identity. But it still applies because you do need to be really careful who can log into the corporate network. And as you say, Peter, and when. Because if you're logging in from, 3 a.m. in the morning, UK time, that's not typical working hours, perhaps for that specific job role it might be, but it's outside the norm. And the likelihood is they shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Exactly. So it's those sorts of habits that would have perhaps triggered a red flag somewhere, you would think, not to mention the fact if you're downloading, tens, hundreds of gig of information that individual shouldn't need in the nature of their day-to-day role, that would be another. So it's all those sorts of behaviours, but in this instance as well, it looked like the individual sort of manufactured an online profile. If you carried out something like a disclosure and borrowing service check, in theory, you would then find out if an individual was genuine, and you'd then have access to various different registers, and it would tell you if, for example, they had any previous convictions, any previous convictions in particular for things around dishonesty, which is always in certain professions and industries a key thing you're looking for. So it's that sort of level of verification, even sometimes down to requesting ID and then verifying that the ID that is supplied is genuine. So i.e. reference checks. Getting ID supplied and also 3 independent references that you can then verify and make sure are true, either through phone calls and video rather than just sending an email saying, is this person true and did they work for you on these dates at these times? The more sort of due diligence you can do, the less chance that you will end up being on the receiving end of a scam like this.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, we are going to be looking at the Data Use and Access Bill. So be prepared, I'll just read out the long title. And it is in fact an incredibly long title. So, a bill to make provision about access to customer data and business data, to make provision about services consisting of the use of information to ascertain and verify facts about individuals, to make provision about recording and sharing and keeping of registers of information relating to apparatus in streets, to make provisions about the keeping and maintenance of registers of births and deaths, to make provision for the regulation of the processing of information related to identified or identifiable living standards. You get the gist. We're looking at a lot of things here. I will just add that was probably a third of the way through that long title there, but nonetheless. So essentially, the long and short of it is aiming to loosen the red tape for businesses and the NHS. It's quite an interesting sort of thing that this bill is trying to achieve. Does it really go far enough in terms of reforming data protection? I will pass over to you, Peter.
And that's a good point. This is not the sort of long-term new data protection bill that had been announced by the last Conservative Rishi Sunak government. Given the number of Conservative governments over the last decade, we may as well refer to it under the surname of the Prime Minister for the avoidance of doubt. So the Sunak government was looking at a more comprehensive reform of laws. Instead, what we've got and what's been rushed through fairly rapidly is a review and tidying up of a few terms with regards to data protection law, really with regards to sort of data sharing, and more focused, if we're honest, on how the public sector handles the sharing and exchange of data, and looking to sort of tighten up how that occurs as a whole. So it's not like we're looking at, as I say, any sort of comprehensive amendment or changing to a lot of the principles behind how data protection works in the UK, which a lot of people will be aware. The UK's Data Protection Act 2018 shadows the European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Really, it's not as though we're going to find ourselves referring to the Data Use and Access Bill in our privacy policies and in our statutory disclaimers in future in a particularly major way. Instead, this is more sort of a little bit of tinkering at the edges and reforming in particular the way that organisations like the police and the NHS handle data. There is some implication for things like open banking, which is seen as an area that is ripe for innovation. So there is a little bit about establishing and maintaining trust when it comes to open banking. There's a little bit more with regards to privacy by design around that. In particular, as I say, there's more around sort of standards for health and social care. And again, this is in England and Wales, don't forget, so slightly different if you end up looking at Scotland as well, of course. And then you've got some, as I say, more broader reforms around things like innovation and growth. So a little bit around automated decision making, but not an awful lot in terms of any sort of substantive regulation or enforcement tools around that. So for a lot of it here, really, it's pretty much as you were.
The interesting thing that we have kind of taken a quick look at is the fact that there could be new rules on the digital verification services, which will allow businesses to get certified under a new government trust framework, which essentially earns them a trust mark to show that they meet the new standards. This is quite an interesting thing because many of you may be aware there are various different stamps that you can have on your website that says we meet X standard. Often that builds public trust and it's a good thing. But there is sort of a flip side here in the fact that actually, if someone can fake this mark, you can then slap it on a website to make it look legitimate. And there you have it. If you're looking at as you've already said, the really ripe area in terms of open banking, if you're then creating a fake open banking website, slap a verified trademark on it, you're good to go, really, in terms of the trust. So there is a bit of a double-edged sword here in terms of implementing this.
There is. I mean, an echo of this, I suppose, is you've already got the government's Cyber Essentials scheme, which is in relation to cyber security rather than data protection. But the basic Cyber Essentials accreditation is just you fill in a questionnaire, you send off your fee, and then you put the logo on your website and your email saying, look, we've got Cyber Essentials. Cyber Essentials Plus involves someone actually coming out and verifying that anything you've put in that questionnaire actually bears any semblance to reality. And not it's and sort of even then within the standards, it's all pretty straightforward and pretty basic, really. But increasingly, local authorities and the public sector will look for the Cyber Essentials accreditation as something they would expect to see with any organisation that they then end up contracting with or working with on a regular basis. So here, when it comes to Data Protection Trust, there's precious little detail really about what this new scheme is going to look like. We don't know what it's going to be called. We don't know how it will be regulated or enforced. We don't know what the standard will be. We do not know, for example, is it just going to be, again, a fill out a questionnaire and send that back with a fee exercise, or is there going to be a more rigorous standard of enforcement? Will it be more applicable for large organisations handling data, or is it tailored more towards the SME? We don't know. So this thing's on the way.
Yes,
it's interesting it's had to be mandated within this bill when already within the Data Protection Act 2018 it did talk about codes of conduct, but there have been precious few organisations that have taken the time to actually set up a code of conduct and the parallel regulation and enforcement bodies that will be necessary for those codes of conduct to operate. So the idea is that individual industries and professions could set up a data protection code to help give guidance to organisations in terms of what they should do within a particular sector or industry in terms of this is what compliance looks like. But no one's ever really, I suppose, jumped at that carrot that was dangled there by the ICO. So in the absence of that, having a verification scheme makes sense. But as I say, let's see a little bit more detail first before we can make any real conclusions.
Precisely, and as you said, Peter, this is on the way, but it is currently at the second reading in the House of Lords, so it's got some way to go before we even see what kind of comes out at the other end, and whether it even looks remotely like the points we've just discussed is yet to be seen, because as we all know, everyone goes in with good intentions, but whether they can agree these good intentions is quite another step entirely.
Yes, what will actually come out of the sausage machine? Watch this space.
Moving on to our final story of the day, we are looking at Meta's launch of the AI celebrity scam Crackdown. So Meta already used an ad review system which uses artificial intelligence to detect fake celebrity endorsements, but it's now seeking to beef up its facial recognition technology. So it'll be it worked by comparing images from ads flagged as being dubious with celebrities' Facebook or Instagram profile photos. If the image is confirmed to be a match and the ad is scam, it will automatically be deleted. And there's a couple of ways that we can kind of look at discussing this. First one being, well, AI is all well and good, it's all jazzy, but it can make mistakes. I think that's the first thing we can sort of address there. Second thing is the fact that, you've got these ads, but more and more can kind of flood the internet, and funnily enough, they can adapt to, avoid this sort of technology as well. And then you've also got the fact that celebrities are also somewhat misguided sometimes and can inadvertently, as we've seen in the past, be at the end of enforcement where they have endorsed their own dodgy scam and it's come back to bite them. I think there's been a few celebrities in the past that have endorsed. Let's take a look at, what was the cryptocurrency chap? Celebrities endorsed the chap that then got sent to jail for fraud and embezzlement. That's always endorsement there. And they were not fake ads.
SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, and FX, which what was incredible when you look back now is that FX was literally sort of sponsoring and loads of blue chip corporations and was seen as very respectable and had loads of endorsements. And yet turned out that the whole thing was fraudulent. Though apparently most of the investors who lost money will get all of it back. So the broader point here is with regards to people who find themselves the victim of AI simulations that purport to be them, where they are seen saying or doing different things that turn out not to be them. It's all fake. It's all fake news. The particular examples quoted here in this article are Martin Lewis, the money saving expert, where regularly you see a video pop up on social media saying, and he's saying, oh, you should definitely do this, and make sure you follow this link and buy this cryptocurrency, or follow this link and switch your utilities and hand all your personal data over to this number, and they'll look after you. There's always these sorts of scams, and because people see it's Martin Lewis, and they think, oh, it must be him, and he's trustworthy, it must be true. Similar thing with Elon Musk, because no one really understands tech, and then if he says, oh, really good thing, and endorsing this, get this thing that's great for UK investors, and of course it isn't him at all. It's just a fake AI saying or doing various different things, and people go, oh, it must be true, and then before you know it, all the money's gone. So they're two particularly big examples of that. And in this instance, the idea is that Meta, with its ownership of Facebook and Instagram, is introducing tools to try and tackle these increasingly prolific deepfakes that are appearing online. But it's a bit of an exercise in whack-a-mole. As fast as you try and get rid of them, more of them tend to proliferate.
And not only that, when AI technology is now quite easy to come by, it's not exactly hard to now get an AI image of something, and if that's openly available on the market, and it's easier for so-called scammers to kind of create one of these things, you have then got an issue where it's easy to do, quick money, and if people are, silly enough to then go ahead with it and maybe not fact check, then it's fairly easy money.
And I think it's interesting that in this year of elections, 2024, we've had elections in the UK, we've got the US election, we've had elections in Spain and across Europe and Africa. It is notable that, of course, elections could conceivably be influenced by a video appearing online of a candidate purporting to say or do something that could either encourage someone to support that candidate or encourage someone to be revulsed by the conduct of that candidate. And as is often, the famous phrase that the lie is halfway around the world while the truth is still doing up its shoelaces. That particularly in an environment where content that can go viral and be believed very, very rapidly, that I think has been a real concern in a lot of the elections this year. In the UK, it was probably less of a problem because I don't think either party wanted to say anything to any extent, really. But it will be interesting in the sort of wash up from the US election in terms of, well, was any of that content that was out there in various states trying to influence certain people, was that all verifiable? Was some of it coming from AI bots? Was any of it actually deepfake? Was any of it coming from any third-party state actors, for example? I don't think we'll know that for quite a long time, and this is being recorded before the results of the US election. It could take weeks or months until we know the result of the US election, but certainly this is being recorded before polling day. So at the moment, who knows?
The other thing that we've not touched on is the other announcement from Meta that has said that they'll use facial recognition technology to help people who find themselves locked out of their social media. So you're looking at identification process.
Yes.
And I think if you're a regular listener, or even if you've not lived under a rock, you know that Meta collects absolutely everything about you, because that is how they make their money. Therefore, if you're now giving Meta the chance to use facial recognition tech to say you are who you say you are, leaves the window open for a lot more data to be collected about you.
Would you trust Mark Zuckerberg with your biometrics?
I don't think I would.
Again, I think that's an essay question, isn't it? We could sit here for hours and discuss the whys and the wherefores and the veracity of whether that would be a good idea. But I think we can probably leave listeners to reach their own conclusion on that. But when you think now of the fact that the majority of hardware includes either a camera that allows for facial recognition or increasingly a button that allows for fingerprint or other biometric recognition, do you wish to share that with either Meta, Apple, Google?
Particularly when a
whoever
lot
it
of
may
these
be.
things are now being used in terms of like online banking for verification. If you can then,
Yes.
break into Meta, steal that person's facial recognition,
Mm.
and then use it to unlock their bank, you're in for a whole load of
Yeah,
problems.
I mean, it's one thing in terms of, I suppose, its use on secure banking apps, as then the other of it being used by everyone's friendly social network, Facebook or Instagram. So, yeah, I suppose my hesitation here in particular is when we look at the volume of regulatory enforcement carried out across Meta's three major platforms of Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp in the past, and whether you would view them as being a safe custodian of that data.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last discussion of the episode. And if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please feel free to email us at admin@digitallawyuk.com. A summary of today's stories are available on our website as well as the links to the original stories containing more information. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you to Anston Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd be interested to hear more about Anston Evaluate's services, please take a look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. And just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and essentially anywhere you can find a podcast. Please feel free to leave us a review as well. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.